And welcome to the Unhinged History Podcast, the podcast where two people compulsively study history on their own because we're geeks. And then we join forces and tell each other the geeky story we've only recently learned and our spouses are tired of learning about. I'm Theresa.
I'm Angie. I was gonna say something and it went right out my brain.
I know I interrupted you to hit record
How
because I'm like
rude.
that. I'm like that, like this is what you can expect from me.
At least you're nothing if not consistent and diabolical. You
Yep.
know,
Yep.
do what you're good at.
I'm
Do
not good
what
at a
you're good
lot.
at.
It's going to be unfortunate.
But the things you are good at, people need those skills, you know?
Feel like Liam Neeson at this point.
I feel like any day that you wake up and say, I feel like Liam Neeson at this point is a win.
All right. All right. Well, okay. So I want to do a hard segue because I don't know how to get out of that one. Um,
I'm just basking in my Liam Neeson-ness.
right. Well, okay. So I think I went first last time with the Children's Crusade.
Okay, yeah, I think you did.
So I
I would
think
tell
that
you that
means
for sure.
that you go first because
I
you followed up with the dude who sold the Eiffel Tower. Count.
Count Lustig,
Yes.
my BFF. Love that guy. Yeah, I can go first. My sources, I'm just gonna get right into it.
Heck yes. Let's do this.
Um, my sources are Gabriel's Conspiracy, Virginia.gov, National Geographic, a really great PBS.org article, which had the most concise, easy to understand writing I've ever read on a historical piece. So I'm a big fan. And of course, the National Park Service.
I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you
Thank you.
because I don't have a park service one today.
I I actually specifically was when I was looking for information on my story, went and looked for information from the National Park Service because I was thinking to myself, there's absolutely no way that this topic doesn't have something within the NPS realm of information, and I was not let down. As always, the National Park Service showed up for everything except for Count Lustig. Rude. But
Well,
anyway, yeah. So my story is a little bit of I would say a little bit of a turn from my normal silliness, but I think that it's an important story to tell. And one of the things that I've been thinking about this whole year is that we have these really special months that we celebrate the diversity of our people, Black History Month, LGBTQ month, we have all of these things, right?
right.
But also, they should be celebrated year round. Like their stories are not just stuck in this vacuum of the month of February or the month of June or the month of May. What, right? So I decided that my goal was going to be to not directly seek out because I feel like that's also unfair to them, but to highlight their amazing champions when I come across them and not hold on to wait for that month to tell the story. Because I feel like there's so many stories we could have an entire year's worth of amazing stories without, you know what I'm saying?
I'm picking up what
Does
you're
that
throwing
make
down,
sense?
and I might have actually done the same thing, but carry on.
I love this for me. So we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So I had discovered that on this day 224 years ago there was an event called Gabriel's Conspiracy. Are you aware of this at all?
I don't know a single thing about this.
I am so excited because neither did I until just the other day when I was like, I think that this had to be a thing, and I don't have a lot of information. So I started looking. So that says National Park Services tells us that the Atlantic slave trade was the forced migration of millions of Africans to Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean between the 15th and 19th centuries. Um, I really just love the politically correct way that they typed in forced migration. It
Yeah,
wasn't migration. You just forced them, but
it was theft,
hmm
kidnapping.
yeah, if you will. Human trafficking. There's many other things, but I get where the NPR is trying to go with this, right? I don't think it honestly gives the gravity of the situation great, but at least they're trying. My story, ironically, starts in 1776, the same year that America as a whole declared freedom from Britain. A baby boy would be born, and he'd be called Gabriel. Gabriel was born on a tobacco plantation owned by a man named Thomas Prosser in Henrico County, Virginia. So, Gabriel was born into chattel slavery, right? So, that being said, very little is known about his parents or his youth, but what we do know, it's very likely that Gabriel's father was a blacksmith. Um, they assume this because at the time, Gabriel was, I don't know, about 10, and his brother Solomon began training as blacksmiths. And typically in Virginia, skills like blacksmithing were often passed down through the generations. So it's kind of a fair assumption to say if he was learning it, he learned it from his father, who learned it from his father, that type of thing.
That makes sense.
Right. So another interesting thing about Gabriel, as a child, he is actually taught to read and write, which I find that remarkable. So you've taught your slaves to read and write,
Which was
and
illegal at the
you've given
time,
them
wasn't it?
I I think that at least in some states it was. I'm not sure about Virginia.
Okay.
Virginia seems to be a little bit different in the way they run everything, but I don't know a ton about the legalities of things amongst the whole
Yeah,
South in general, right?
it's not South Carolina.
Georgia, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so the old man teaches Gabriel learns to read and write, and he is taught this skill, like this exceptional artisan skill, which I think is just wild. Because I would think if your goal is to continue on with this scheme of slavery, then giving them skills like that seems like a terrible idea.
Elaborate on that.
If you're gen Well, think about it. In my opinion, the best weapon you can give somebody is the ability to read,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Education. The one thing you
Exactly.
can never
But
take away.
exactly. And so I thought that whoever Old Man Prosser was, the fact that he did this, it tells me a couple things. A, I think he actually valued the families that he had in his slavery in some capacity, whether he valued them as just a financial aspect or he valued them as humans is unclear, but the fact that it seems that he kept families together and he taught the children how to read and write says a lot. But of course, this is several hundred years ago, and we can't go back and just ask him what his thoughts were. But either way, it doesn't negate the fact that he thought owning people was okay.
Mm.
Like that's where I stand on that. But I do think it is really fascinating that Gabriel in specific, was taught to read and write. It's also said that he was incredibly intelligent and unusually large. In fact, by the time he reached 20, he was between 6'1" and 6'3" in height. To give you some context, the average white man at the time, because, of course, that's the information we're going to get,
That's the
was
default.
about 5'6". So you're working with 5'6" to possibly 6'3". So he's a big fella. Not only is he hella smart, but he is ridiculously strong from his years as a as a blacksmith. So they say that even the older slaves, by this point, they're looking up to Gabriel as a leader. He's big, he's strong, he's clearly intelligent. He sees what's happening in the world, and he is not one to back down from a situation. So I'm going to set the stage for you a little bit. Old man Prosser dies in 1798. And the young Thomas Prosser, and I mean young, so old man Prosser dies, his son's only 22, and he becomes the new master of Brookfield Plantation. Thomas was probably the worst. Like, he was cruel, he was ambitious, he was in cold, like money talks for him, you know? He is exactly the type of character you picture when you think of slave owner.
Oh, joy.
Yeah. PBS says it's likely that he pushed his slaves too hard. So that's kind of the crap that Gabriel and his friends are dealing with at home. But in this area, which I don't know if this happened in other states, I wouldn't be surprised if it did. But in this area, there's a tradition of basically renting out your skilled slaves to others, like merchants or other masters in town. So, for example, Prosser, seeing that he can make a buck off the back of Gabriel, rents Gabriel out as well as his brother to merchants in town and other masters in town because he has a skill set that can be used outside of his own plantation.
I think we've talked a bit about this kind of concept before.
I think we had, but I couldn't place the information. So
Yeah,
I
like
was like, huh,
I can't think of whose story. Was it Robert Small early in his life?
maybe?
I,
I
I
feel like,
say that out loud and I don't think that's right.
well, no, Robert Small in general, I think his mother lived in town. So he had the ability to go back and forth between the plantation and in town. And if I remember right, when he started becoming an early teen, no, his mother didn't live in town. When he started to become an early teen and was getting a little rambunctious, they sent him to a master in town. I can't say that they rented him out per se. They were just trying to
Okay.
get him away from the plantation itself. So that might be the same idea, might not.
Okay.
Either way, there's definitely a history of slave, like, I don't want
Leasing,
to say this.
which
Yes,
subleasing, gross as that is.
yeah, it doesn't, whatever. But anyway, so Gabriel's being rented out in town, and it's interesting because there's already legislation put into place to stop this, but no one really does anything to actually enforce it because it makes them all money. You know, funny how that works.
Yeah, bizarre.
And I'm unclear about why the legislation was there. My only guess is it wasn't to benefit the slaves.
Well, I think because there were some, if I'm not mistaken, there's some areas, and this could be different area, different chunk of time. So this is me dredging up some half open file in the back recesses of my brain, where if you have a slave who has a specialty skill, they're able to um, give their owner, I hate the words, a chunk of their money, but to live off of their owner's land and practice their skill, their trade. So they can kind of own or earn money and do their own thing, but still, does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I'm unclear why legislation in this particular time and space is existing to stop the idea of leasing out your slaves.
Probably because they didn't want to give the slaves any kind of financial reprieve. That would be
That's
my
what I'm
thought.
thinking. That's what I'm thinking. It's unclear to me what the benefit to white society was. I'm thinking there was none. I think it was simply to try to hold down, to maintain slavery as it was.
Yeah.
But regardless, um, while all this, this legislation is happening, you can imagine that the hired out slaves, they're given a bit more freedom than normal anyway. In fact, while away from the plantation, these individuals are meeting and enjoying the company of other hired out slaves white laborers, and even freed people of color. Because
Good.
in Richmond, this area was home to freed slaves who were actually able to do really great business and make a good living despite like the really harsh realities of the time and place they lived. They did well for themselves. Now, all this is happening and benefiting the pocketbooks of the authorities and landowners. Another thing that's happening right under their nose, and it scares the hell out of them, is that the freed blacks, the hired out slaves, and the white working class, they're working and socializing and building these really strong bonds with each other.
Mm.
And it's pretty clear. This scares the wealthy white minority, so they feel compelled to limit any socializing between them. Laws are passed, and the bars that were catering to both and all races at the time, they're raided. So, as you've mentioned, history doesn't happen in a vacuum, and the world at large is going through some other things. So, as I said before, Gabriel's born in the same year that we declare independence. So, he's a child through the American Revolution. And then in 1791, there's the uprising in Saint-Domingue in Haiti.
Oh, that was huge.
Yeah, and they know about it because by 1793, people from that area are moving to Virginia. So the story is spreading. So it's not like they're lacking in news, right? So he's got these two things going for him. And then on top of all of that, he's hearing some really radical words from what PBS says were white artisans. These individuals are absolutely champions of the working class, regardless of color. And as all of this is happening, and he's seeing the relationships and the success of the freed black slaves of the area, he's thinking, huh. Additionally, he's got real big feelings about these merchants because they're routinely cheating out the hired slaves. He's got a pretty awful master. And not only that, but he wants to be free, like just your basic human right. He just wants to do his thing. So the wheels are spinning for him, and he starts putting stuff together. And at this point, his thoughts and his actions are bordering on revolutionary. So I'm going to assume treason is the word at hand, but he's
Mm.
he's thinking some things.
Well, it's only treason if you lose.
Well,
All
by
right.
1799, Gabriel is finding himself less and less worried about what the establishment thinks. Himself, his brother Solomon, and another slave called Jupiter steal a pig. And when they're caught, Gabriel wrestles the white overseer who found them to the ground, at which point Gabriel bites off most of the overseer's ear.
Oh, that's a move.
Hmm. Yeah, bold, right? So, Mike Tyson, you weren't the first one to do it. It was Gabriel. Um, he's found guilty of the capital offense of maiming a white man, and he's, as they say, headed to the gallows. However, he gets out of his execution because of a loophole called benefit of clergy. Have you ever heard of this? Because I had not.
Nope, this is new.
Okay, so benefit of clergy basically means he's allowed to choose public branding over execution if he can recite a verse from the Bible, of which he does. Right then and there, he recites his Bible verse and gets branded on his left hand, and he spends like a month in jail. So, all things considered, bet the branding super was very uncomfortable and probably very hard to deal with, but he's alive.
Yeah, it's
And
not ideal,
things
but
are
it
starting,
works.
yeah, things are really starting to bounce around in his mind. He's thinking a revolt might not be the worst idea, and now might be the time. PBS says, quote, he believed that if the slaves rose and fought for their rights, the poor white people would join them, which I think is really interesting. But then if you think about the fact that they've already been forming these strong bonds, and it's likely the poorer white people are kind of feeling the same way, it's not surprising.
Yeah.
So the idea is to seize Capitol Square in Richmond and take Governor James Monroe hostage. with plans to bargain with city authorities while holding Monroe hostage. Later testimony says that additional plans were made to, quote, go to the nation of Indians called Catawbas to persuade them to join the Negroes to fight for white people. To fight the white people. They also believe that a French army was landed at South Key, which they hoped would assist them, which I find so funny because the British were selling weapons in Haiti during the revolt in Saint-Domingue 9 years earlier. So it really feels like the French could have looked at this as a big ol'
Yeah,
easy
like
payback check for
a
them.
comeuppance.
Yes, if
Oh,
you
karma
will.
called.
We showed up. We were invited to the party. I I'm
They're getting invited to the
unclear.
cookout is what I'm hearing.
Exactly, exactly. Them white folks can come to the cookout. Um, Unclear if that's actually the case. If the French would have been willing to help, I'm not. I wouldn't be surprised if they were though, because we know how France and Britain's relationship for so long operated. It would make sense. So Gabriel tells his plan to Solomon and other slaves that belong to Prosser. And then the recruiting begins. At this time, I'd like to mention some of his compatriots. We have Sam Bird Jr., Young, Ben Woolfolk, and Jack Ditcher, just to name a few. However, and I find this fascinating, but it also makes sense, this rebel army that they're recruiting and that they're building does not include women.
Interesting omission.
I know, and I have thoughts about it, but they're simply thoughts and opinions. So I'm wondering if the idea was to not like if the women even knew, if the idea was to do that without incorporating them into it for their safety, or if there was some other reason. I'm very curious, but unfortunately I don't have an answer. So while the majority, though, of these men are slaves, there are freed black and there are a few white workers in their cause, especially in Richmond. There are also two Frenchmen and a militant abolitionist. And so we have Charles Keirsey and Alexander Bedenhurst. They join this quest as leaders. And I love this. And quote, a slave recruit named King was told of the plot and said, I was never so glad to hear anything in my life. I'm ready to
Mm,
join them at any moment. I could slay the white people like sheep.
dang.
He
Dang.
had some big bills. So these fellas, they're recruiting an army from Richmond as well as other towns all over Virginia. We have Petersburg, Norfolk, Albemarle, and they're going from the counties of Caroline and Louisa. They're recruiting slaves from Henrico County. Their thought is they're getting ready to plan the biggest, most far-reaching party ever planned in U.S. history. They also start amassing weapons and begin hammering out swords of scaths and molding bullets.
Scythes?
Yes, I call them scaths. I've never been able to say them right.
Okay. To
I
be fair,
know.
it is a weirdly spelled word.
That's why I've never been able to say them right. It's like, when you're reading a fantasy book and the name
And
is
you're
just blah,
just
blah,
like,
blah, blah.
yeah, you're all the name that starts with E, the main character, E.
That guy. That's
Yep.
the one. Yeah. I've never been able to say it right. And I've said it wrong for so long, I forget that it's wrong. But anyway, by August of 1800, Gabriel's army is ready. They are now also planning to include the taking of Norfolk and Petersburg by the men living in those areas. The event is set for the night of Saturday, August 30th. As the news of the date is being relayed into the outer areas, a rumor of insurrection surfaces among Richmond's white, who then report it to Governor Monroe, who then immediately ignores it. So bad on them, right? I mean,
I mean,
we
look,
could have done something to squash this a while ago, but we didn't. On the night of August 30th, a torrential downpour begins. Some say it was the most terrible storm ever witnessed in the state. Only a handful of men show up at the designated meeting spot, but because it's pretty clear pretty quick that the rising water is going to make the roads and bridges impassable, they decide to postpone until Sunday evening, August 31. However, before they have a chance to carry out their plans, slaves in two different places lose their cool and tell their masters. So once
Oh,
again, Governor Monroe is told, and a white patrol, and then later the state militia begins searching the countryside looking for the rebels. Gabriel and Mr. Ditcher disappear. Others managed to elude capture for several days, but by September 9th, like 30 of them had been captured and were in jail awaiting trial. I'm unclear of why this is specific to this, but they're awaiting trial in a court of or interminer, a special court in which slaves were tried without the benefit of jury.
I mean, I could tell you why I think it's happening, and the word starts with an R and ends in an ism.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting that there's a court designated for it because I would have thought that was the case anyways. But I didn't. So here I am, right? So by the time the trial begins 2 days later, so it's now September 11th, Gabriel and Ditchers, they're still missing, and white authorities have like no clue how extensive the insurrection had been. So they're like, holy beans, what do we do? But as usual, the whites are terrified at the thought of how close the danger had come, specifically very fearful that the black men were out for their white ladies.
Which, yeah, likely no.
It seems like such a cop out. Like
How about
I'm
they just want to be able to live without their family being taken apart, dismantled, and
wild.
beaten, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm thinking the white ladies were the last thing they were worried about. To be honest, that was probably never a thought in their mind.
Yeah, probably a perk, but not the main objective.
Exactly. So the authorities use this nasty tactic and offer a full pardon to a handful of slaves who are willing to give testimony against the conspirators. So, going to say this quote and hopefully say everybody's names right. Quote, Jervis Storrs and Joseph Selden, two of the court magistrates, found two key witnesses in this way. Ben, one of Prosser's slaves, and Ben Woolfolk. Prosser's Ben came forward first, and his testimony sent a number of slaves from his area to the gallows, including Gabriel's brother Solomon and another man called Martin. But Prosser's Ben did not have enough contact with the slaves from the outlying areas, so the court looked to Ben Woolfolk to give the damning evidence. And then the other slaves provided or further testimony. The fact that Ben Woolfolk was one of the leaders initially and then just totally turncoats breaks my heart.
You
But
know,
at the same time, a
we're
full pardon
missing
is in hand.
we're missing a lot of that middle part where that confession was likely gathered under duress.
That's that's part of why it breaks my heart because on one hand, you see that he has given up this other information that could damn other individuals. But then on the other hand, at what cost?
Oh, yeah, because we're
So,
missing the weeks of beatings.
right. So across the board, it's just heartbreaking to me that they used these other individuals against each other. Like that just anyway. On September 14th, Gabriel swims to a schooner called Mary on the James River. He asks to see the captain, who of course is a white man named Richardson Taylor, and he was formerly an overseer. However, Taylor had since changed his mind on slavery and tried to take Gabriel to freedom. But when they docked in Norfolk, the two other black men on board, Taylor's former slave called Issam and another slave called Billy, identified Gabriel as the leader of the plot. It was Billy who had alerted the white authorities to Gabriel's presence. It was likely that Billy was thinking of the $300 reward being offered for Gabriel's capture. Gabriel and Taylor are both arrested. Billy was rewarded, but he still gets screwed. In the end, he receives only 50 bucks. They're thinking of the 300. Remember
Yeah.
so they're thinking that his idea was to turn Gabriel in hopes to purchase his own freedom. Now, the part I don't fully understand here is that Taylor, the ship captain, had changed his mind on slavery and he no longer agreed with it, but Billy was still a slave. I'm unclear who Billy was a slave to.
Yeah, good question. And maybe he's one of the least people, and the
That's what
captain is
I'm
like
thinking.
you know what? I don't like slavery, so I'm gonna be a kind human to oversee you because at least I know what it's like and I'm not gonna be that form of evil.
That was my first thought, but there's nothing to really clear that up. It's also possible that maybe Taylor still technically owned him and it's just predicated on the when you can buy your way out kind of thing because he's living in that society.
And I think
I
that
want to
there's
go
some
with the
pretty
first
strict
option.
rules on when you can free your slaves, because I think we've covered that previously, where certain time periods, certain regions had very different
Yeah.
setups.
So, yeah, but regardless, Billy's the one to get him caught. And he does not make his full 300, so he does not become free. The heartbreaking ending of this part of my story is best told from PBS. They say that, quote, on October 6th, Gabriel was put on trial, but Gabriel refuses to make a statement. He was sentenced to be executed the next day, but asked that his sentence not be carried out until October 10 so that he could be executed along with six other slaves who were also to hang that day. The court
Mm.
agreed, but on October 10th, they hanged the slaves in three different locations, and Gabriel was hung alone in the town gallows.
I hate that. I hate that.
Right? I promise it ends on a high note, though. I promise. In all, the trials lasted about 2 months. 26 slaves were executed by hanging, and then another died by hanging while in custody. So I'm assuming
Lynched.
yeah. At least 65 slaves were tried. Of those that were not hanged, some were transported to other states and some were found not guilty, and even a few were pardoned. By law now, slaveholders had to be reimbursed by the state for their lost property, of course. So, in cases where slaves were executed or transported, their masters were reimbursed for their total worth declared by the court. Do you want to know the numbers?
Sure. I mean, we're here. Might as well go
Yeah.
through it.
Okay. Virginia pays over $8,900 to slaveholders for the executed slaves. Today, that's just over 2 million.
Ugh.
Yeah.
I'm
I
looking
will
for that
say
high note. I'm looking for the
it's
high note.
coming. It's coming. I will say that a couple of interesting things come out of these trials. Slaves that were captured in other counties were tried in those counties. In Hanover, two slaves escaped and were never found. In Norfolk County, the magistrates questioned slaves and working class whites together, trying to find witnesses, but no one, including the accused slaves, would come forward with evidence, and as such, the slaves were released. In Petersburg, four freed blacks were arrested, but they were released because the authorities were so frustrated that they couldn't find proper witnesses. However, there were some slaves willing to give condemning evidence, but, and I just love this for this moment in time, the testimony of slaves against free people was inadmissible in Virginian courts. Love that for them. The motto of this revolt was the battle cry of the San Domingue, death or liberty. But it all ends in a really amazing way because also on this day in 1983, Guion S. Buford Jr. was the first African American astronaut to travel into space.
Wow.
Hmm. So while it starts out very heartbreaking in this very low place in human history, I thought that the fact that both events happened on the same day needed to be celebrated. Guion served as a mission specialist aboard the shuttle orbiter Challenger, and he would be on board for at least three more missions and served 700 hours in space. He is still alive today.
Yay!
So that's my story of Gabriel and Guion Buford.
Okay, I'm here for it. Thank you. I didn't know about either of those, so those are brand new to me.
I was so excited to see that I could correlate those two together like that. It made my week because I thought to myself, first of all, I'm devastated. I knew nothing about Gabriel's revolt. Why isn't this taught in class? Um, and second of all, why aren't we celebrating all of our astronauts? And the fact that just separated by a couple hundred years, these stories exist. It seems like they should exist together regardless, but the first story should have never happened to begin with.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
So, that's where I stand on that.
Well, I love that you told it to me.
Yeah.
And then I have a story for you that there's a lot of overlap. There's a ton of overlap, and you're going to be like, wait, what? Um, okay. I'm going to tell you the story of the Harlem Hellfighters.
Okay.
You
I've
have
only heard the
no
name.
Okay. So the Harlem Hellfighters are the 369th Regiment. My sources are Fatherland by Burkhard Bilger, New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center, the Library of Congress, NPR, National Guard website. I had some fun. Okay. So Library of Congress starts us out. During World War I, over 350,000 Blacks served overseas in the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, during World War I. Most toiled away in very important, but they're very menial positions. They're unloading ships, they're camp laborers, they're clerks.
They're the
Bet
boots on the ground.
well, boots on the ground can also mean grunts, which means front, like serving on the front.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's important to call out these weren't necessarily on the front. They were largely kept back from that. Between about 40 to 50,000 Black troops served under French commanders during the war, largely in the 93rd Division of the AEF. And they consisted of the 369th through the 372nd regiments. No Black troops experienced as much combat as those assigned to the French military.
This checks.
Now, the reason why we have, over 350,000 Blacks that were serving during World War I, but only less than 50,000 were actually on the front lines is racism.
That old thing?
That old thing, that little peach. Um, they didn't necessarily believe that Black people were smart enough or capable or insert whatever modifier you want to use. And so they just put them in the jobs that they didn't want to do.
This checks.
Okay. So June 1917, the Selective Service Act allows for able-bodied men between ages 21 through 31 to get enlisted into the military. Now, foreign-born Americans and Blacks are overdrafted. Surprise, surprise. While
This
Blacks
also
make up
checks.
10% of the population, um, they end up making up about 13% of draftees,
Okay.
with only 11% serving in the fighting as National Guard units.
National Guard is the one that they're not like full-time military, right?
Um,
Or today they're not.
yeah, you ask questions like that, and I'm like, I know very little about the National Guard, and I know enough to try to keep my mouth shut so I don't
Good call.
really
Let's just
mess this up.
eliminate this.
Yeah. So, okay, so now America has an influx of Black soldiers coming in. Now, The government organized its first officer training camp for Black troops during World War I, but this camp is segregated.
Of course.
Now, it's located in Des Moines, and it's trains only enlistees for the infantry, meaning these Black soldiers volunteered for this assignment. They're not drafted.
Okay.
White officers decide that they're going to issue imparting military or artillery and engineering skills to these enlistees, even though these skills are critical on the front, where many of these soldiers are going to be found. And they're going to need things like artillery and engineering units.
You would think.
You would hope that you would give your troops, regardless of what they look like, the best things to fight for you. This seems like a
That's
self-serving thing
ideal.
you would want to do. However, even
We're
with
not
its,
known for our genius during wartime. Let's, you know, well,
I
at least
think
at
we can
that
hack
moment.
off the last part of that sentence.
Yeah,
We're
we're
not
not
known
known
for
for
our
our
genius.
genius. Yeah.
And then just
Yeah.
call it. Um, so even with its focus on infantry, the camp's leaders decide that they're going to not necessarily train their charges for the challenges ahead. But the division that emerges from this camp that's going to experience combat, they've also had to deal with white officers who take every single opportunity to denigrate the people underneath them while obscuring their own leadership failures.
This
Because
checks.
consistency.
As we say, you're nothing if not consistent.
So meanwhile, we have the grunts, not the officers, that are being trained in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
Okay.
Now, NPR reports that there were 10 standoffs that arose between the Hellfighters and the white residents in Spartanburg. Max
10?
Brooks, the author, what?
You said 10? 10 standoffs?
Tense. Tense.
Tense. Okay,
Yes.
I
So
totally misheard
very difficult, very
you.
trying, very fraught.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, no, I got you now, but I heard 10, so I was like, oh wow,
No,
10.
you're
Okay.
yeah. That thankfully
Whew.
there we I don't have a number, but Max Brooks, who's the author of the Harlem Hellfighters, which is a graphic novel about the first African American infantry to fight in World War I, he says it was a powder keg, that the whole nation's keyed up for another race riot, and you're sending black troops to train in Southern Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union.
This feels problematic.
Mm, mm. He goes on to say that what separates a soldier from a civilian is discipline, the notion of mental control, and the notion of restraint. And adds, I don't think any soldier, short of a samurai, has shown more restraint than the Hellfighters at Spartanburg.
Mm,
Which,
I that just means I'm gonna hate the next sentence, huh?
well, maybe. Okay. So one's trained. Soldiers, officers. These soldiers are moved under the leadership of General John Blackjack Pershing.
Oh, Blackjack Pershing. Okay.
Yeah, we
Okay,
mentioned
carry
him
on.
in episode 14 when we covered Sergeant Stubby, the dog that fought in the
Mm-hmm.
war. Um, he's commanded black soldiers in the Spanish American War, the Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippines, and we were pretty positive on Blackjack the last time we brought him up.
We were.
Okay, uh, despite having worked with black soldiers, Pershing's a bit more than just a little problematic.
Oh, this checks.
The
Of
All
course.
Black Regiment was some of the only troops that General John Blackjack Pershing was willing to put under the command of the French.
Of course. Okay.
Before he does this, he circulates a memo to the French command to explain secret information regarding Black American troops and living in close contact with them. He talks about how at the time there's around 15 million Black people in the US and how their numbers would, quote, create a menace of degeneracy had there not been an impassable gulf created between the races. He later, so basically, like,
Wow.
They're awful. And thankfully, we've put them under our boot for so long to keep them docile. Yeah. He then says that the French population has grown accustomed to treating Black people with familiarity and indulgence. He says that Blacks are an affront to the national policy and that there is a fear that the French will teach the Blacks ideals that white Americans will find intolerable.
I hate this for us.
He goes on to call the Blacks inferior beings, and it goes on. It
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The French ministry orders all these memos gathered and then burns them.
I love the French for this.
Mhm. The 369th is the first Black regiment to reach European shores in late December of 1917. And the French army absorbs the Hellfighters to replenish their own ranks, finally giving them an opportunity to fight that the US Army denied them. Still, we have French officers who doubt whether these Black soldiers have enough courage to go into battle.
What have they been dealing with for the last several hundred years? I don't think they lack courage.
Yeah, I wouldn't, but it's an unknown quantity. We're not looking at it from their end. You know what I mean?
I guess.
However, the Hellfighters did not disappoint.
No,
Quote,
they earn the name Hellfighters.
well, we get to learn how that comes. I should have like crossed that name out until we get to this part or until we get further down. But the French are shocked at how willing the Americans are to charge into the face of death. Max Brooks, who wrote the graphic novel, he goes on to say, everybody in this unit had so much to prove on every level. The soldiers had to prove their courage. The officers had to prove their intelligence and their courage. There was really the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Hmm.
Now, it's about around this time that they're the first to gain notoriety for their fighting skills when Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts successfully defeated a German assault, earning the French's military's highest honor, the Croix de Guerre. The first heroes of the American army came from that regiment, wrote Noble Sissel. He describes the relations between the French and their African American counterparts as generally good. French officers befriended African American troops and officers, while non commissioned officers, quote, treated our boys with all the courtesy and comradeship that could be expected. The regiment gains the nickname the Harlem Hellfighters by the Germans, who were surprised to see an entirely Black regiment fight so well. Pershing,
Ugh.
because I can't leave this man alone, didn't realize that the French and Black troops who'd served so divisively at Verdun, Campaign, and the Somme. So regardless, Pershing wants the white American troops to outdo the Black brothers in arms. The enemy clearly fears the Black troops. They also fear the French Black troops, who are mostly Senegalese and Algerian. They take no prisoners.
I love this
So
for them.
Black skinned troops on the opposing force just spark terror in the hearts of the Germans. Two white aviators are captured, and they confirm the German fear of Black troops. They're questioned, and when they were questioned of their numbers while at two different prisons, Lieutenant A.L. Clark and V.H. Bergen were both asked how many Black Americans served on the other side at the front. Like these
Like, we
captured
need to
aviators.
know.
Yeah, like, look, I'll give you info on my guys, but how many Black people you guys got with guns? You got to tell me
Like,
because they haunt
because
my
listen, I'm
dreams.
hearing some stories.
Like,
I
I
can't
close
sleep at
my
night.
eyes and they're there. They're at the foot of my bed in the trenches. They're everywhere.
Ugh, I love this.
Most Black African, and I'm going to say, like, I realize African American and Black, there's a very difference in those terms. And I go back and forth. I've been going back and forth, likely just because my sources are jumbled. I believe Black is the preferred term. I'm going to do my best to default to that. But when I slip, because I have slipped, that's the logic and the thought process. So whether these Black soldiers are fighting for the AEF or the French military, they experience a ton more freedom in France than they ever did in the US. Though the French, they have their
This
own
makes
racial
sense.
issues. Yeah. Um, Black Americans find the country devoid of the Jim Crow segregation that they have at home, and many are dating French women, which infuriates these white AEF counterparts.
I love this for them.
Yep. Melville Miller is 16 when he joins the Harlem Hellfighters, which was first formed of the 15th New York National Guard Regiment. Decades after World War I, he can still recall marching through formerly German occupied territory. This is a quote from him. That day, the sun was shining and we were marching. The band was playing, Miller told the interviewer in a 1977 documentary called Men of Bronze. Everyone's head was high. We were all proud to be Americans, proud to be Black, and proud to be in the 15th New York Infantry.
Mm.
M- Members of the 369th Infantry Regiment wear their Croix de Guerre medals in 1919, and Miller and his comrades were awarded those medals for their bravery, as stated above, and they're welcomed home with a parade in New York City along Fifth Avenue, an honor denied to them before they left for the war because of their race.
We're gonna need you to fight a war, but also, we're not gonna talk about it.
But when they come home, they get the parade, which is cool.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Yeah. Um, the Harlem Hellfighters, despite fighting the longest of any American regiment, is not allowed to march in the Paris parades. U.S. President,
Really?
yeah. Well, it's because of the U.S. pressure.
Hmm. This checks.
They also disallowed it in place of a national war memorial in France. Prior to World War I, there would have been no hesitation for the government to use and trust Black soldiers. In March of 1917, the District of Columbia National Guard, 1st Separate Battalion, it's all Black, guarded the reservoirs, power plants, and public buildings against sabotage. The US government trusted more in Black soldiers than it did in the newly enlisted foreign-born soldiers, especially the Germans. And Black men enlisted to serve in the manual labor positions were put there in order to replace the Japanese Americans. Now, this is World War I, but
Wow.
we already clearly had a defined structure in place. Now, when the Harlem Hellfighters return to New York, they meet with some uninviting MPs who were instructed not to salute any 369th soldiers, white or Black. So the 369th, they have their own parade since they're not invited to join the Victory Parade of 1919. The march made headlines throughout the country despite the government's efforts to squash it.
Yes.
Now, even though the 369th has experienced several reorganizations in the past 100 years, it exists today as the 369th Sustainment Brigade. The 369th now operates at Harlem Regiment Armory in New York, which was prominently displayed on February 22nd during Black History Month on a feature on CBS New York, which was hosted by Maurice DuBois.
Wow.
And that is the story of the Harlem Hellfighters. And I found a delightful photo of them,
Oh,
which
I was
I
gonna
will
ask.
show.
I'm like so excited.
So that is them playing, I presume, in Europe, but they are credited with bringing jazz to Europe.
Of course.
I'll let you
Look
describe
at
what they're
that.
seeing.
I am doing a terrible job describing what they're seeing because I'm just delighted. Okay, so the image is taken from behind a band conductor. They're in full military uniform, and he's got the band kind of in a U shape around him. They're on a street. Um, I can't quite tell like the dimensions of the street or anything like that, but you've got onlookers looking out the window, and these fellas are getting down. There's a whole line of trombones and clarinets and flutes, and I think is that a French horn in the center?
I believe so.
Yeah, they are playing the music to these onlookers in the windows in the building above them. That is so fantastic. It's sepia tone. It's that like, brown and gray and white
Yep.
coloring. It is absolutely fantastic. When you told me you had a picture, this is not at all what I was imagining. This is so much better.
Well, I mean, you might have been expecting these
That's
are
what I was
recruits that
imagining.
would become the 369th Regiment.
They're all in their dapper hats. Ugh, everyone, there's what, two, four, six, eight fellas all dressed to the nines with their bowler caps and their newsies and their straw straw hats.
Yep.
Ugh. I would like to personally hug every one of them. They look like some pretty stand-up chaps. I'm here for it. That's what I was kind of imagining you were going to show me.
Yeah, and
Thank you for that.
so I fell into this story because I was listening to the book The Fatherland. That was one of my sources up top, and it was about a German man, American, who grew up with his family having a very strong German background. And he's learning more about his grandfather who fought in, I think, World War II. He fought in World War II. And
Okay.
he fought on the Nazi side. And so this man is trying to really uncover who his grandfather was and what his grandfather's beliefs really were and trying to untangle all of this between lore and, what he can back up. And he includes that line about General Pershing. And he actually includes nearly the entire memo. And I was like, oh, Blackjack Pershing. Oh, no, no, no. And then it was
This
like,
can't be the same Blackjack Pershing.
yeah. And then it was just like, okay, everyone is complicated. Everyone is a mix of good and bad traits, some more so than others. And it was just like, I got to learn more about these troops that he passed off and what happened and what did they do and how did they do. And it was just like, oh, these guys are fabulous.
Of course they are. Look at them. Well, are they wearing armbands?
They are,
I
I
can't
don't know
quite.
anything about what those are or say, but yes, they are wearing armbands. I don't know what those are, and I
Hmm.
don't see them explained anywhere.
Well, I love it. I love it so much.
So, yeah. If you're thinking, holy cap, or cap, holy cap, holy hat man, um, and you're wondering what the heck we are going to bring next week, good question. We haven't started researching yet. We'll go through our list of notes. Rate, review, subscribe, and share us with your favorite holy hat man. And on that note, goodbye.
Bye. I now have an image of a hat man that looks very wizardy